It's always wonderful to see the dynamic tension between the legislature and the executive branch. And this week it was put on display. On May 26, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan vetoed 4 bills, including a measure that he described as sanctuary state legislation. This legislation would require those counties that have agreements with Immigration and Customs Enforcement to jail detainees, and he would force them to terminate those contracts by October 1st, 2022. Mike, this bill targets Frederick and Worcester counties, which have detainee contracts with ICE. What interest did the legislature have in what is really a local determination?
Well, I mean, it's the ongoing immigration discussion, and unfortunately, because we have such lack of leadership from the federal level, we then get to having a debate between the state and the jurisdictions, and I think that becomes a real challenge. One of the things I'm intrigued by, and I know this was a case that we had in Montgomery County early on, is the correctional facility had these relationships, and the rest of the jurisdiction in the county didn't necessarily know that that relationship existed, which I think creates some interesting dynamics and something to pay attention to. I assume at this point, given the focus on immigration, that the legislators and the leaders in these counties understand that their correctional facilities are actually doing this. I think it's challenging. I think the state wants to say, hey, we don't necessarily want to be subject to an arcane set of rules, an arbitrary set of rules that the federal government's kind of put together. By the same token, it is hard when individual jurisdictions have made a decision. And so I think it's just this tension that only further reinforces that we've got to get back to what are we going to do with immigration reform at the federal level, so we actually know what rule we're all playing by.
Well, there is the argument that perhaps there's too much involvement at the state and local level, that the states and local localities shouldn't be making immigration determinations on their own.
I don't disagree to some degree, but the other challenge is, if this is a federal issue, then the feds should not be effectively deputizing state and local resources to do the job that they are then contracted to do. And so, if you're going to do it, and don't let us get in the middle of it. If you don't have the resources to do it, then that's a different conversation.
Well, the observation I'd make is you're never going to have any immigration reform, any series of different various proposals, unless a component of that includes effective enforcement. And that's been part of the deal, if you will, for all prior immigration proposals. It certainly was the proposals that had been under consideration. And part of the challenge of not having this sanctuary state legislation is it undermines whatever case folks may have for some sort of dreamer legislation. Since again, if you are not prepared to say that some people shouldn't be in the country and are legally excluded, then you really have trouble making kind of the compelling cases on behalf of those that there might be a consensus around including.
I think that becomes the challenge, though, is right now those are all kind of a la carte sets of activities, and so those haven't been stitched together in any meaningful way. And I think that becomes the challenge, is in the absence of that, saying we can't have this without this, then people are kind of picking and choosing on both sides of that equation. And so I think I agree with you that people have to know that both sides of that are going to work, but it's hard, I think, until people see from whichever vantage point they're looking at this, that we're willing to go here, if we could see you're willing to go to the next step on the other. And I just, without any cohesion, it's really hard to get to that point.
Well, let's go on to our next topic, which also deals with criminal matters. And Governor Hogan vetoed a bill that would decriminalize possession of certain drug paraphernalia. And he also vetoed bills that would make people who are convicted of life and given life sentences eligible for parole at an earlier date. What is the likelihood that these vetoes will be overridden?
Well, unfortunately, this has tended to be a sort of party line issue, and actually there really are some conflicting public policy considerations. Unquestionably, we have a drug crisis, heroin crisis, of overdoses and what have you. And while I appreciate the reluctance to criminalize addiction, the point is to be made that when there are drug paraphernalia arrests, it's really often an opportunity for an intervention to take place. There are a variety of diversion programs that exist in the criminal justice system where folks can get treatment, and it can become a sort of fork in the road in which to turn around for recovery. And I think it's unfortunate that in this debate about, criminalization and law enforcement generally, that what is lost is this particular opportunity to perhaps save lives by giving people an opportunity to get off the drugs that are ensnaring them.
Well, it's not just the decriminalization issue of drug paraphernalia, but it's also the issue of reducing sentences for individuals who have been who are on parole, who are entitled to earlier parole. I mean, as the governor emphasized when he vetoed this, there are victims associated. It's not just that the defendants who have been convicted are incarcerated. There still remains living victims who suffered at the hands of criminal behavior. So these are two issues that the legislature is going to take up. But Mike, I want to before we go into this segment, I want to talk about an action that the governor announced the other day, which was he is among a growing list of governors who are proposing to cut off unemployment benefits earlier than anticipated and turning back federal dollars. Many have criticized him for this. What is the right decision here?
What's the right decision? That's an interesting one, because I know that there's the notion that because we have these unemployment benefits, that's what's leading to the challenges in the labor market and people aren't coming back to work. And I think that certainly could be a contributing characteristic, but I think you also have to look at, are people looking at other opportunities? Are there jobs there anymore? Do they need to change skills and get different places? And I think that it's challenging to say that it was solely the unemployment benefit that's the cause of people not coming back to work. And so the question is, how are we beginning to address those other issues to make sure that we actually have a pathway to get people back into the workforce? And it can't just
that may be true.
Money away.
Let's not just sugarcoat it. When we had welfare reform in the 90s under President Clinton, we saw people returning to the workforce. They had an incentive to go back to work and to look for a job. It was just today alone, Six Flags announced that they have 80 full-time positions that they can't fill because there are not enough people looking for jobs, and they're going to have reduced hours all summer long as a result. So there needs to be an incentive for people to go back to work.
And don't just take Six Flags or other employers' word for it. Mark Elridge has talked about the fact the county is having trouble opening facilities such as libraries because they didn't fill, as vacancies came up appropriately, they didn't fill those positions, and now they got to fill those positions, and they're having trouble finding people.
I think it's also interesting, though, to see what are those occupations being paid. I mean, I think that's one of the other pieces. And so to bring people back to a $9 an hour job, a $10 an hour job, and they can't make that work, I think the employers have got to look and understand the economics of the situation that we've got and make sure they're paying people a living wage to make that work.
Well, that's a very valid point. And just to stay on the Six Flag analogy, they announced that they're paying $13.65, up from $9.50 for full-time employees and part-time employees. So the competitive marketplace, which always is self-correcting, is at work again. So thank you for being so much in favor of the free enterprise system there, Mike.
As a small business owner, I got nothing else to do but that, buddy.